My mother knew that she was seen and she was heard in her anguish.
Naomi Judd was more than a country music legend. She was the heartbeat of one of America's most beloved families. But when she died in the most tragic of circumstances, everything changed. The spotlight dimmed, and behind the scenes, the Judds were left shattered. However, Ashley Judd has broken her silence, revealing what really happened in those final days. Why was Winona back on stage just hours later? And could the rumors of a rift between the sisters be true? For so long, their pain was hidden. But now, the truth is finally out, and it's devastating. The tragic life of Naomi Judd. Naomi Judd wasn't born into fame, and she certainly didn't stumble into it. Her journey was a complicated mix of heartbreak, reinvention, and resilience. To millions, she was a radiant force in country music and a woman who sang about love, family, and faith. But behind the stage lights and award ceremonies was a life riddled with pain, silent battles, and a deep longing for peace that fame never truly brought her. Naomi Judd was born Diana Ellen Judd on January 11, 1946, in Ashland, Kentucky, a small Appalachian town known for its hard-working communities and deep musical roots. Raised in a modest household, she grew up with traditional values, surrounded by the sounds of country, bluegrass, and gospel that would later shape her musical identity. Her father, Charles Judd, owned and operated a local gas station, while her mother, Pauline, worked in a cafe along the riverfront. Life was simple, but not easy. Unfortunately, the family experienced tragedy early on when Naomi's younger brother, Brian, died of Hodgkin's lymphoma at just 17 years old. This loss deeply affected Naomi and stayed with her for the rest of her life. By the time she turned 18, Naomi's life had already taken a dramatic turn. She became a mother to her first daughter, Winona Judd, born Christina Claire Simonella in 1964. Naomi had married Michael Kiminella, Winona's legal father, around that time, but unfortunately the marriage didn't last. A few years later, she gave birth to her second daughter, Ashley Judd, in 1968. Now a single mother of 2 young children, Naomi was determined to build a better life for her family, even if it meant doing it alone. Raising Winona and Ashley as a single parent was far from easy. Naomi had no wealth or safety net. She juggled jobs to keep the family afloat, including work as a waitress and secretary, while also trying to further her education. She enrolled in nursing school and earned her degree, eventually becoming a registered nurse. This period of her life was defined by grit and sacrifice. Naomi often described how she would come home from hospital shifts and spend her evenings helping Winona with homework, cooking dinner from scratch, and piecing together second-hand clothes for her daughters. Money was always tight, but she kept the family together. In the late 1970s, Naomi packed up the family and moved to Los Angeles, hoping to give her daughters access to better opportunities. While living there, she continued working in healthcare and tried to provide some sense of stability for Winona and Ashley. But Los Angeles didn't offer the long-term answers Naomi was hoping for. Eventually, she made the bold decision to relocate once again, this time to Nashville, Tennessee, the heart of the country music world. By then, it was 1979, and she was in her early 30s. When they arrived in Nashville, Naomi continued working as a nurse to support the household. But something had shifted. By this point, she had started to recognize her daughter Winona's incredible vocal talent. The two had always sung together casually, often harmonizing to old country songs in the kitchen or in the car. But Naomi saw potential in their combined sound. With her medical job as the family's financial backbone, she began networking, studying the music industry, and finding every opportunity for Winona and herself to break into the local music scene. In the early 1980s, a major turning point came when Naomi managed to secure an audition at RCA Records. At the time, she was working as a nurse for a doctor whose patient had music industry ties. Using her charm, determination, and a homemade demo tape, she convinced executives to hear them sing live. What they heard was something raw and unique: Winona's soulful, emotionally resonant voice, backed by Naomi's smooth, steady harmony. It didn't take long for RCA to sign them as a duo, and from that moment on, they became the Judds. The success of the Judds was almost immediate and overwhelming. Their style was refreshing, rooted in traditional country, with a modern flair that set them apart from the rest of the genre at the time. Naomi, always dressed in prairie skirts and soft curls, exuded warmth and maternal strength on stage. On the other hand, Winona, who was bold and expressive, carried the lead with an unforgettable voice. The mother-daughter chemistry was palpable, and fans quickly connected with their authenticity. Their debut EP, Winona and Naomi, was commercially successful, and even featured a hit song that shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart in 1984. From there, they launched into an extraordinary run of success. Over the next several years, the Judds released a string of country classics that became emotional touchstones for fans across America, often reflecting the family struggles and values that Naomi herself had lived through. Their early branding leaned into Americana authenticity. They performed as the Hillbilly Women, wearing matching leather jackets and introducing themselves in unscripted, homespun ways to stand out in crowded bar rooms. By the mid-'80s, their second album, Why Not Me, became one of the fastest-selling debut country albums ever. Between 1984 and 1991, the Judds earned 14 #1 hits on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. Their artistry was recognized by Grammy Awards, Country Music Association Awards, and American Music Awards. They performed to sold-out arenas, dominated country music radio, and helped define a generation of family-friendly country storytelling. But Naomi wasn't just a performer. She was a songwriter and a manager, steering the duo's brand and image with strategic precision. Behind the scenes, she handled business negotiations, tour planning, and creative decisions, all while balancing her role as a mother to two daughters who were each finding their own voice in the spotlight. What often gets overlooked in Naomi Judd's story is how fiercely independent she was, even before the fame. Long before spotlights and record deals, Naomi was already forging her own path. She didn't wait for life to happen. She made hard choices and kept moving. She often spoke about growing up with a deep inner drive that wouldn't let her give up, even when she had every reason to. Perhaps what's even more impressive is the fact that despite their fame, Naomi never forgot her roots. She remained deeply connected to her Appalachian upbringing, often speaking about the importance of faith, resilience, and family in interviews and public appearances. In 2022, decades after the Judds had released their final album and Naomi had mostly stepped away from music, the country music world gave her one final, long-overdue recognition. Naomi and Winona were inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, cementing their legacy as one of the most influential duos in country history. It was a career milestone that symbolized not just chart success, but cultural impact, and a reminder of what Naomi had built from nothing. But what the world didn't see beneath the awards, applause, and carefully controlled public image was the growing darkness Naomi carried within. And in the years after the Judds' final tour, that darkness would begin to take over. Naomi's heartbreaking struggles. Behind Naomi Judd's celebrated music career was a private world few people ever truly understood. After years of touring, recording, and standing in the spotlight as one half of the Judds, Naomi's public image had become synonymous with strength and survival. But after she stepped away from performing in the early 1990s, a very different chapter of her life, marked by physical pain, psychological trauma, and an unrelenting battle for peace of mind, began. In 1990, Naomi was diagnosed with hepatitis C, a potentially life-threatening illness she believed she contracted during her years working as a nurse. At the time, medical treatments for hepatitis C were limited and often ineffective. The diagnosis came as a shock, not only because of its severity, but also because it forced her to make a decision she never imagined having to face, leaving the music industry at the height of her success. At just 45 years old, Naomi officially retired from performing, ending the touring life she had built with Winona over the previous decade. For fans, the announcement was heartbreaking. But for Naomi, it marked the beginning of an entirely new struggle that played out mostly in silence and far from the public eye. Her body was under siege, and she was forced to adapt to a medical routine that often left her exhausted, isolated, and emotionally drained. Determined to do more than just endure her illness, Naomi channeled her energy into founding the Naomi Judd Education and Research Fund, a nonprofit aimed at raising awareness and funding research into hepatitis C. It was a way to turn her diagnosis into something larger than herself, to help others understand a disease that was often misunderstood and stigmatized. But while she became a public advocate for liver disease awareness, her private pain was far more difficult to address. In the years that followed, Naomi began to experience an even deeper and more debilitating challenge, a prolonged and complex battle with mental illness. What began as episodes of depression soon evolved into a cycle of treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite access to some of the best doctors and treatment programs available, she found little lasting relief. The medications she tried often came with harsh side effects, and the periods of stability were fragile at best. At her worst, Naomi's mental health struggles became so severe that she experienced inappropriate thoughts, withdrawing almost entirely from daily life. There were periods when she would not leave the house for weeks. Even basic routines like getting dressed, eating, and speaking to loved ones became difficult. Her world, once filled with music, travel, and excitement, became smaller and quieter with each passing month. In the mid-2000s, Naomi made the difficult decision to undergo electroconvulsive therapy, a treatment used in severe cases of depression when other interventions have failed. She also spent time in psychiatric hospitals, receiving intensive care designed to stabilize her condition. These were not decisions she took lightly, and they marked just how deeply the illness had affected her. Naomi often described these experiences not as moments of defeat, but as necessary lifelines and desperate attempts to pull herself out of a darkness that medicine alone could not cure. By 2016, she chose to publicly share her mental health journey in a memoir titled River of Time. The book offered an unflinching look at what she had endured in the years since retiring from the stage. She described a mental and emotional spiral that left her unable to function, even when everything around her looked fine from the outside. She admitted to long periods of immobilizing despair and chronic emotional pain that made daily life feel unbearable. While she had written several books before, this one stood apart. It wasn't about career milestones or family anecdotes, it was about survival. But Naomi didn't just speak out, she took action. Even as she continued to navigate her own health challenges, she became a tireless advocate for mental health awareness. She partnered with organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness and worked closely with professionals at psychiatric hospitals. She attended conferences, sat on panels, and offered personal insights into the realities of living with chronic mental illness. She also co-authored articles and public messages drawing from her own lived experience to help others feel less alone. But what stood out the most was her approach to advocacy. She didn't use clinical language or try to soften the truth. Instead, she focused on telling people what it really felt like to live with a brain that refused to cooperate, how exhausting it was to pretend everything was fine, how disorienting it was to wake up and feel instantly defeated, and how mental illness could hollow out even the most joyful moments. She emphasized that what people saw on stage, including the confidence, the strength, and the glamour, was just one part of her story. Even as she made strides in her recovery, Naomi's battle with depression was never truly over. There were better days, but the threat of relapse never disappeared. She once described her emotional pain as something that lingered, even when her life was objectively full of love, achievements, family, and admiration. And in the final chapter of her life, as the music world prepared to honor her legacy, Naomi faced a moment of unimaginable pain that would bring her story to a heartbreaking end. Just hours before her family stood on stage to accept the award she had waited her entire life to receive. Naomi's final days and tragic passing. In the weeks leading up to her death, Naomi Judd was preparing for what should have been one of the most meaningful moments of her life. After decades of contributions to country music, the Judds were finally set to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was a long-awaited recognition for the legacy she had helped build with her daughter Winona, which was filled with chart-topping hits, sold-out tours, and songs that had touched generations of listeners. Behind the scenes, however, Naomi was facing an overwhelming internal storm. Though she had continued her advocacy and appeared publicly from time to time, her mental health had once again begun to decline. Those closest to her noticed the signs of withdrawal, despair, and moments of deep emotional struggle. Naomi was still seeking treatment, still fighting to hold on, but the depression that had plagued her for years had returned with painful intensity. On April 30th, 2022, just one day before the Hall of Fame ceremony, Naomi's life came to an abrupt and heartbreaking end. She was 76 years old. Her death was reported publicly as a loss to mental illness and occurred under extremely tragic circumstances at her home in Leipers Fork, Tennessee. It was a moment that stunned the music world and left her family shattered. That morning, her daughter, Naomi Judd, had come to visit, a routine that had become part of their close relationship. At some point during that morning, Naomi sent a short message asking for help. When Ashley arrived, she found her mother in a state of visible distress, restless, pacing, and expressing her pain. It was not the first time Naomi had spoken those words, but that day felt different. The heaviness in her demeanor made it clear that the emotional pain had reached a breaking point. Ashley stayed close, trying to offer comfort and reassurance, not knowing how little time was left. At one point, Naomi walked upstairs, and moments later, Ashley followed, only to discover the unthinkable. What followed was a wave of emotion no daughter should ever have to endure. In those final moments, Ashley sat beside her mother, held her hand, and tried to find some sense of peace in an otherwise traumatic experience. She later spoke publicly about how much she loved Naomi, how beautiful she looked even in that moment, and how deep the loss would remain in their lives moving forward. Her words were, "We just breathed together, and I talked to her and told her how much I loved her, and it's okay to go." The Judd family released a statement shortly after Naomi's passing, confirming that she had been lost to the disease of mental illness. They wrote, "Today, we sisters experienced a tragedy. We lost our beautiful mother to the disease of mental illness. We are shattered. We are navigating profound grief, and know that as we loved her, she was loved by her public. We are in unknown territory." However, they chose not to focus on the method, but instead on the decades-long battle that Naomi had fought quietly and courageously. Her struggle had been ongoing, and her death, while sudden to the public, was the final moment in a long and painful journey. The official autopsy report confirmed the family's report, and the toxicology analysis also revealed the presence of multiple medications, which had been prescribed to manage her ongoing mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, and bipolar-related symptoms. In the days following her passing, tributes poured in from fellow artists, fans, and public figures. Many remembered Naomi as a trailblazer in music, a loving mother, and a woman who had given hope to others through her mental health advocacy. But for Ashley and Winona, the loss was deeply personal. They hadn't just lost a public figure, they had lost their mother, their confidant, the center of their family. What made Naomi's passing even more heartbreaking was the timing. Just one day later, on May 1st, 2022, Winona and Ashley attended the Country Music Hall of Fame induction ceremony, where Naomi was honored posthumously. Through tears, they stood on stage and accepted the award that their mother had dreamed of receiving. It should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it became a moment of mourning, where the family had to balance public recognition with private grief. For many fans watching, the ceremony was difficult to process. It served as a powerful reminder of how invisible mental illness can be, even in the lives of people who seem strong, accomplished, and deeply loved. Naomi Judd had spent her life helping others, building a legacy of compassion and strength. And yet, in her final hours, she still felt overwhelmed by the weight of her illness. And even as Naomi's daughters stood side by side in front of cameras and fans, some fans began to point out how grief doesn't always unite, but can also quietly divide. And in the weeks after Naomi's death, whispers of tension began to emerge, hinting at a complicated dynamic between Winona and Ashley that even decades of family history couldn't easily mend. A possible rift between Winona and Ashley. In the immediate aftermath of Naomi Judd's passing, the image of her daughters standing together at the Country Music Hall of Fame induction left a powerful impression. Dressed in black, eyes swollen with tears, they accepted their mother's award with a poise that was both admirable and deeply painful to watch. It was barely 24 hours after losing Naomi, yet Winona found the strength to walk on stage, honoring a moment their mother had been anticipating for years. Winona, known for her strength and fiery stage presence, addressed the audience with gratitude and resolve. making it clear that she would continue the legacy Naomi had left behind. Her message was clear. The show wouldn't stop. Her voice might be filled with grief, but it would not be silenced. In the days that followed, Winona turned to social media to share her grief more intimately. On Instagram, she posted a heartfelt tribute expressing her disbelief and devastation. Her words carried a tone of both reflection and resistance, as if she was willing herself to keep going even as her heart broke. She wrote that this cannot be how the Judd story ends, and many fans could feel the depth of her sadness between the lines. She spoke of mourning not just her mother, but a lifetime of complex memories, unfinished conversations, and the sudden silence that now surrounded her. For Winona, Naomi's death seemed to open a floodgate of emotion that had been building quietly over time. She later shared how she found glimpses of hope in music, in family, and in her own resilience. Over time, fans and observers began to notice subtle signs that not everything between Winona and Ashley seemed aligned. Despite their united front at the Hall of Fame ceremony, the emotional processing of Naomi's death appeared to take different shapes for each sister. Winona, as the daughter who shared the stage and business with Naomi for years, seemed to carry a distinct weight tied to their musical bond, their history as a duo, and the long hours on the road that sometimes came at the cost of closeness. Winona later spoke about feeling disconnected from her mother in the years before Naomi's death. Touring, professional pressures, and the natural tensions of a mother-daughter partnership had created emotional distance. While they had remained in touch, Winona admitted that there were gaps in their relationship and moments when they didn't fully see or hear each other. Naomi, to her, was both strong and incredibly vulnerable. But it was that contradiction that haunted her most. Beyond the grief, Winona was also juggling personal responsibilities that few outside the family fully understood. Her daughter Grace had faced legal challenges that resulted in incarceration, and Winona had stepped in to raise her granddaughter, Kalia. At a time when she was trying to process her own mother's death, she was also navigating the emotional demands of parenting a young child, managing a career, and holding her family together under public scrutiny. As the weeks passed, quiet speculation began to surface about a potential rift between Winona and Ashley. Reports emerged that the sisters were allegedly in disagreement over Naomi's estate, including decisions about property, memorial plans, and legacy projects. While neither sister confirmed a public dispute, the rumors fed into a larger narrative about how grief, fame, and family complications can collide in difficult ways. Some insiders suggested that Ashley, having been the one to physically discover their mother on that devastating day, had taken on a more protective stance regarding Naomi's memory. Winona, on the other hand, seemed focused on honoring Naomi's career legacy through music and performance. Their approaches, while not necessarily at odds, were different, and in grief, differences can sometimes feel like divides. Others speculated that the emotional distance between them wasn't new, but something that had quietly existed for years. Winona and Ashley had lived very different lives. Winona rooted in music, motherhood, and rural Tennessee, Ashley in acting, activism, and international causes. They loved each other, but they didn't always move in sync. Despite the rumors, both sisters continued to show up in public moments when it mattered. Whether it was honoring Naomi's memory through written tributes, sharing old family photos, or supporting charitable causes tied to mental health, they demonstrated that even if their grief was different, their love for their mother remained unshaken. And then, after months of silence and unanswered questions, Ashley Judd finally opened up. In her own words, she revealed what really happened after her mother's tragic death and what she believes the world needs to understand about her mother, her family, and the truth behind that unimaginable day. Ashley Judd reveals the truth. In the months following Naomi Judd's passing, the world turned to Ashley Judd for answers. As the daughter who found her mother and stood at the center of a very public tragedy, Ashley held not only the memories of that day, but also the deep emotional burden of explaining it to the world. For Ashley, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about truth, healing, and honoring her mother's complex journey. From the very beginning, Ashley was open about the trauma. Ashley was the last person to speak to Naomi, She comforted her mother in those final moments, expressing love, presence, and understanding, hoping to ease Naomi's pain, even as the unthinkable unfolded. That tender, brief, and deeply emotional conversation became one of Ashley's final memories of her mother. And in the wake of Naomi's passing, Ashley's public statements remained grounded in compassion and honesty. She refused to gloss over the harsh realities of mental illness or hide behind the stigma that so often surrounds such losses. As part of her own healing process, Ashley turned to eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, a trauma-focused method used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. The goal was not to forget what happened, but to process it and to allow the brain to make sense of pain that often defies logic. It was, for Ashley, a way to work through the shock and grief while also preserving the love and humanity that existed between her and Naomi. Public curiosity often lingered on the Judd family dynamics, especially given the intense media attention after Naomi's death. But Ashley was clear and consistent in her message. Her relationship with Winona had grown stronger, not weaker. Despite speculation of tension, both sisters emphasized their shared commitment to honoring their mother's legacy and maintaining family unity. Ashley explained that their bond had been forged through shared history, grief, and a mutual desire to support one another, even when that meant embracing their differences. Winona herself had once described her relationship with Ashley as funny, not in the humorous sense, but in its uniqueness. She once said, "I raised Ashley. That's why we have such a funny relationship, because she calls me Sister Mommy. And I'm a little bit sad about that because I didn't get to be her sister." Ashley had often looked up to Winona, but also carved her own path, not as a country music star, but as an accomplished actress and activist. Still, the two were more connected than the public realized, and after Naomi's death, they leaned on each other, choosing closeness over conflict. Ashley's advocacy took on new urgency in the months that followed. She began speaking out more boldly on mental health, prevention, and the need for compassionate, trauma-informed care. She partnered with organizations dedicated to reducing the stigma around mental illness, using her platform to amplify conversations many families are too afraid to have. For Ashley, telling the truth wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about ensuring that her mother's legacy included her battles as well as her brilliance. She believed Naomi deserved to be remembered in full, as a talented performer, a loving mother, a woman who gave everything to her family and her fans, and someone who also lived with intense psychological pain. In the end, Ashley didn't want her mother to be remembered for the way she died, but for the life she led, the love she gave, and the truths she dared to face. What would you love to see Ashley Judd and Naomi Judd collaborate on? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.